Well, thank you, Wanwira, and hello, everyone. It is truly a pleasure to be with you here. I know it's morning for you. It's late afternoon, almost evening for me here. As Wanwira mentioned, I'm based in Palo Alto, in California, in the United States, and I just wanted to spend the next hour or so with you, just giving you an introduction to futures thinking, who we are, what we do, what is futures thinking. I do apologize because I unfortunately do not speak Thai. I wish I did, but I will do this presentation in English. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask it in Thai. I'm sure we can get someone to translate. If I'm going too fast, please let me know. I can always slow down. But I'm just going to give you a little taste of futures thinking, and then leave some time for your questions, leave some time for your reactions, your opinions, anything that you may have. And I hope for to have a fun discussion with you on this morning for you guys. But just as a little bit of background, the Institute for the Future, as far as we can tell, we are the world's longest running futures think tank. We were a spinoff of the Rand Corporation in 1968 here in the United States. So we've been around for over 50 years, and our goal is to combat what we call short-termism. This notion that businesses, that governments, that industry leaders are so focused with what's happening tomorrow, what's happening next week, what's happening next month, that we completely forget to think about what's happening in 10 years, what's happening in 50 years, what's going to happen in 100 years. So what we do is we come and we focus on what we call urgent futures, connective technologies, and transformations to daily life. And we like to pull the view and say, what is likely to disrupt life as we know it, business as we know it, our industries as we know it in the next 10 years? Now, very important, we don't use the word predictions. We don't believe anyone can predict the future. We create what we call forecasts. And just like a weather forecast, a forecast really is an indication of what's possible based on evidence that we're seeing in the present. Now, one of the questions that we get as futurists is, why do you focus on 10 years? What's the reasoning behind a 10-year forecast? Well, from our experience, we find that 10 years is far enough out to be beyond business people's normal planning horizon. Normally, business leaders will think 1, 3, 5, if you're lucky, 7 years into the future. So 10 years is our area of expertise because not too many people focus on that. But also 10 years is also close enough in. If we do something and we say, this is to prepare us for the next 10 years, there's a sense that what I'm doing today, the strategy that I'm leading, that I'm building today, will have an impact in 10 years. It's much harder to feel like you're going to have an impact on the future if you go beyond that. So that's why we focus on 10 years. Now, if you ever come out to California, if you ever come out to Silicon Valley, we are in downtown Palo Alto, across the street from Stanford University. In a pre-COVID world, we have a public gallery that is open to the public, and folks can come in and look at our research. If you see a researcher walking around, you can just introduce yourself and ask them to tell you a little bit about our work. But we've been in Palo Alto for the majority of our existence. And we love what we do. We love sharing futures thinking with anyone who will listen. And that includes Thailand. That includes bringing this way of thinking, this methodology, all the way out to Thailand. Now, there are 3 big lessons that we've learned from practicing futures thinking over 50 plus years. And the first lesson is that no one can predict the future. Now, there was a time early in the Institute's beginnings when we tried predicting the future. We tried going out and trying to predict what would happen. We quickly learned that it was nearly impossible to accurately predict the future. What we can do is learn how to think about the future systemically, turn that uncertainty into inspiration and action for increased resilience in the present. And so what we do here is we take a futures approach, we take a futures lens, and we apply it not to say what do we think is going to happen, but what do we think could happen? What is it that could happen in our future? And are we prepared for that possibility? So the first big lesson, no one can predict the future. Especially in today's world where technology and innovation and even external disruptions are just so disruptive. COVID-19 has really taught us that it's really hard to predict the future. It's really hard to anticipate how the future is going to unfold as things are constantly changing, constantly evolving, and things are constantly in a state of uncertainty. Now, the second lesson is a very simple but profound one. What we have found, particularly amongst business leaders, is that they operate in a present forward mindset. So most business leaders, government leaders, nonprofit leaders think in the now, what do we need to do now? Then they think, what comes next? And if there's time left over, they start to think about the future. If you're used to operating in the horizon model, you think horizon 1, you jump to horizon 2, and then you jump out to horizon 3. What futures thinking has taught us over the last 50 plus years is to simply change the order. And instead of present forward strategy, we like to implement what we call future back thinking. And so it's the same concept, but you're flipping the order. You start in the now because there are deadlines to meet, there are commitments to make. You have to run your business, right? You have to run your business in order to still have a future. So you start with the now, but then you jump out to the future. In our case, it's 10 years into the future. And once you understand what's possible in 10 years, you work backwards to what comes next. So in the horizon model, instead of horizon 1, horizon 2, horizon 3, we advocate to go horizon 1 out to horizon 3, and then backwards to horizon 2. So that's the second big lesson in futures thinking, is adopting this future back mindset. Never worry about what's happening next until you have an understanding of where the future is headed. Now, the third and final lesson is that the future is inherently difficult to think about. It's really, really hard to think about the future. And that's why most people don't spend a lot of time thinking about the long-term future. And part of this is there are 4 common traps that make thinking about the future difficult. And so I'm going to go through what those common traps are and the strategies that we help people implement in order to help them get around that. Now, the first common trap that makes futures thinking difficult is we have a bias towards precision metrics. Somehow human nature as business people, we really love metrics. We really love numbers. And the more precise a metric is, the more we tend to love it, right? We love probability, we love percentages, we love numbers. And what you're seeing here is a US example, but it's definitely one that was visible across the world. In the presidential election before the most recent here in the US, between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, the metrics told a very convincing story. And regardless of what part of the world you were in, regardless of what political party you identified with here in the US, the numbers told a pretty convincing story that this election was going to favor a certain candidate. And now we see, obviously in retrospect, that the opposite happens. The opposite of what we expected to happen actually happened. And so our job as futures thinking is to look at quantitative data, but also qualitative data. So we don't just want to look at numbers. We also want to look at soft data. We want to look at soft evidence. We want to apply these mixed methods to make sure that we're not being convinced or we're not being brought over to one side simply because we have a bias towards it. So that's the first common trap. The second is that of official futures. And there are official futures all around us. Your companies, your businesses, your industries have an official future. And that's a good thing. Your company needs to have an official stance of where they think the future is headed, where they think your industry is headed. Oftentimes, what tends to happen is we accept these official futures as the only future. And so we say, well, if my company thinks the future is headed in this direction, I'm not going to pay attention to anything else. And so here you see the Forbes magazine cover from 2006 here in the US. And Forbes magazine said, Nokia, 1 billion customers. Can anyone catch the cell phone king? And in the same year, in 2006, Nokia released its corporate report, and they were saying the same thing that Forbes magazine was saying. They were saying, listen, we have the largest market share. We are the biggest, we are the baddest, we have the most in this industry, and it's nearly impossible for anyone to come in and take what we own, take our hold as the number one cell phone company in the world right now. This was an official future, right? Forbes magazine, Nokia corporate report. Those are official futures, voices of authority that we listen to for good reason. Now, again, in retrospect, we see that in 2007, just a year later, someone by the name of Steve Jobs came and introduced the iPhone. And now when we present this, people scratch their head and they think, does Nokia even make cell phones anymore? Is Nokia still a company? Are they still around? So our job is to look to these official futures and challenge them to say, yes, that may be a future that you think is going to happen, but what if that didn't happen? What are the other possibilities? So we want to challenge these consensus forecasts and provide an alternate point of view. Again, we're not trying to predict the future. We're trying to lay out the multitude of possibilities that could exist for the future. The third reason is generally we have an anxiety about change. We don't like change, and if you need more evidence than the current state that the world is in, no one really likes change, right? The change that COVID-19 brought about was very uncomfortable. It was very hard. It still is very hard for us to deal with, and that's just because we have a general anxiety about change. So our job is to help people recognize where their personal sources of stress come from. What makes change so anxiety inducing? What makes change so difficult for us to accept? And how might that cloud our judgment? And knowing that, understanding that, we're able to work around that and think through and better position ourselves so that we're not being reactionary to the future, but we're actually being proactive. And instead of reacting to the future happening to us, actually working to make the future. Now, the fourth and final reason why futures thinking is inherently difficult to do is because your future self is a stranger. And there's actually neuroscience evidence behind this. There was a very interesting study done with fMRI brain scans. And so researchers brought together a group of participants, and they put them in these fMRI brain scans. And they asked the participants to talk about themselves. They said, tell us your name, your age, your job, what do you love, who's in your life? And when the people were talking about themselves, the medial prefrontal cortex, the front part of the brain, would activate. It would light up in the fMRI scan. Now, when the researchers said, talk to me about a friend, a spouse, a parent, someone they were familiar with, the part of the brain would still activate, but not as bright, not as much. So the researchers said, interesting. They came in and they asked them to talk about a complete stranger. They said, they gave them a picture of a person and they said, tell me about this person here, someone you don't know. And what the researchers found is that as a person talked about a stranger that they didn't know, the medial prefrontal cortex did not activate at all. As these participants were talking about someone they weren't familiar with, that part of the brain did not activate. So the researchers said, well, this is very interesting. So they went back to the participants and they said, we have one final question for you. Tell me about yourself, but tell me about yourself in the future. What is your job going to be in 20 years? How close to retirement are you going to be in 30 years? Where are your kids going to be in college and university in 40 years? And interestingly enough, the same phenomenon that happened when a person was talking about a stranger happened when they were talking about themselves in a future state. And so what this told the researchers is that thinking about yourself in a future state is the equivalent of thinking about a complete stranger. It's very, very difficult for us to do. And that's why we tend not to do it. We tend not to do it naturally. So our job is to design processes, to design experiences, to walk people through tools and methodology that help them pre-experience the future, to put them in a future state and say, if this were your reality, if you woke up tomorrow and this was your reality, what would be your reaction? So we want to make the future vivid as possible, to get people to react to it rather than just read and think about the future. So we do all of this by what we call Foresight, Insight, Action. And Foresight, Insight, Action is a cycle, a methodology that we've developed. And there's 4 phases to the cycle, and it starts in prepare. And when Wira mentioned the class that we taught at TMA, and we actually structured the course around this cycle here. So we started in prepare. And prepare is all about gathering evidence. It's all about preparing yourself, getting yourself ready to think about the future. What is a future that you care about? What is the right question about the future? What is the evidence and the research that you can start to gather that is going to inform the direction that the future is headed in? That's the first phase in prepare. From there, we go to foresight. And foresight is all about taking the evidence and the answers to the questions that we asked and actually coming up with plausible, compelling, provocative narratives of what the future could look like. Again, these aren't predictions. What these are multiple visions of what the future could look like. So this is where we go in, we write a narrative and we say, imagine that in 2031, the world looks like this. And what happens from foresight is once you hear foresight, it generates your insight. It generates this moment of clarity, what we call an aha moment. This moment where you understand the world a little differently based on the foresight. The great thing about an insight is that once you've had an insight, you can't go back to your old way of thinking. Once the foresight has unlocked an insight for you, you can't go back and say, well, we're going to go back and continue running our business as normal because, or continue business as usual, because you now understand from the insight that the future is going to look differently. And in order to prepare yourselves for that, you need to change your strategy and your way of approaching the future. So that's the third phase, insight. And finally, we get to action. Now, action is where a lot of business leaders are really good at. That's where we're measured. That's where, we're measured up against in our metrics are what action did you take? The difference in this action is that it's informed by thinking about the future. It's that future back approach. Instead of just saying, this is where we are today, and this is where we want to get to in 10 years, here's the action that we take. We say, this is where we are today. and understanding how the future could change in the next 10 years, this is what I think we should do next in order to prepare us for the disruptions that lie ahead. So that's foresight, insight, action. There are a couple key terms when you're talking to a futurist or you're talking to a futures group that you'll come across. And the first is a forecast. A forecast is a story about the future. Again, it's not a prediction, but it's a vivid, realistic vision of what the future could look like based on evidence in the present. We're not writing science fiction. What we're doing is we're looking around the world and saying, what are those changes that people aren't paying attention to, and how do we imagine them growing and expanding, and write a vision of that. From a forecast, we can write a scenario, and a scenario is a certain kind of forecast. The great thing about scenarios is you can have multiple scenarios from the same forecast. So we can have a foundational forecast, and from there say, let's build out a scenario where things are all positive or things are all negative. Oftentimes we use the 4-scenario archetype that was developed by noted futurist Jim Dator. And he talks about a growth scenario, a collapse scenario, a constraint scenario, and a transformation scenario. So in that case, we have a base forecast, and then we say, what does growth look like for this forecast? What does constraint, transformation, and collapse look like for this base forecast? So those are some of the terms that we talk about, but all describing writing stories about the future based on present day evidence. And then evidence comes in 2 formats. Evidence comes, first, what most people are used to are what we call drivers of change. You may have heard of them as trends, as macro trends, mega forces. These are these long-term phenomenon that we know are changing our future. We know are shaping our future. Things like aging population, artificial intelligence, climate change, these very broad terms that we know and understand are going to impact our future. There's no way to avoid it, right? Our future is going to be impacted by self-driving cars. That's a driver. Our future is going to be impacted by climate disruption. We're seeing evidence of that. That's a driver. Now, the other kind of evidence is less common, and this is what we call a signal of change. And a signal of change is a small or local innovation that has yet to scale, but it has the potential to scale. And so what we do is we go out and we find these signals of change that most people don't pay attention to. And we ask the question, if this signal were to become the new norm in the future, what does our future look like? And that actually has resulted in being the key recipe for forecasting the future. I talked about our job isn't to predict the future, but we've actually kept track of our forecast. And in 50 years, 60 to 80% of our forecasted futures have actually come to life. And that's because we're looking at both drivers of change, these broad trends, and these signals of change. And so William Gibson, the famous science fiction author, said, the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. And that's what a signal of change is. The signal of change is the future in the present that hasn't distributed yet, that hasn't scaled yet, but has the potential to scale. And so what we do at the Institute is we go out and we hunt for signals. We look for those signals that most people aren't paying attention to and think about, if these signals were to scale, what does that mean for our future? So questions we ask when we're talking about signal is, what kind of a change are we seeing? Oftentimes we say, what are we moving from and what are we moving towards? The second question we ask ourselves about signals of change is, if this signal became the norm, if this signal were to become common, what does the world around us start to look like? How do things start to change? And finally, is this a world that I want to live in? Is this a future that I'm excited about, or is this a future that I'm scared for? And what I'd love to do here before turning over to your questions, Wanwira and Anya, if you could help me, I would love to share with you all in the room a couple signals that we're seeing from around the world and just get your reactions to it. Help me answer the questions here. What kind of a change are we seeing? What does the world look like if this signal becomes the norm? And is this a world in which you want to live in? So Anya or Wanwira, I don't know if we have a mic that we could pass around, but the first signal here is a game. It's actually a mobile app. You download an app on your phone, and it's called Knack. It's the Knack app. And the way that it works is you play a series of games, and there's an algorithm in the background that analyzes your gameplay. And after you've played a series of games, it goes out and it finds jobs that require the skills that you've demonstrated through your gameplay, and it offers you a list of jobs that you would be good for. And what it does is it also goes to employers and it gives them profiles of people who have a knack for the job that they have listed. So this is a real thing. It's really happening. You can go out and find this in the real world today. It's a mobile app where potential employees are playing games. And just by playing games, they're being offered jobs. So going back to our list of questions, what kind of a change is this? What are we moving from? What are we moving towards? If this becomes common, what does the world of hiring look like in the future? And is this a world you want to live in? So Anya, Wanwira, I don't know if there's anyone in the room who would love to stand up and just give me their reactions to this signal of change.
Hello.
Yes.
Virapat from PDT-GC. It's interesting, your example here. I think the signal from the, like forecasting or understanding people from playing a game would be maybe, as you mentioned, it's a weak signal, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, what is your question? Are you going to ask what would be the future, or what is the question?
So the question that we ask ourselves is, if this signal becomes the new norm, right? If 10 years from now, we're hiring people just by having them play a video game, what does that world look like? What does that mean for your company? What does that mean for the industry?
Okay, so if this continues, I think people no need to looking for a job, because the company would able to pick up you from the data, big data or whatever that they can access.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That I totally agree. You can even stretch this a little further and say resumes are obsolete. There's no need for resumes. Who cares where you went to school? As long as you can beat the game that tells us that you can do the job, you're hired. We don't care about degrees. We don't care about educational background. We don't care about your past experiences. Just demonstrate through gameplay that you can fulfill the job. Absolutely wonderful. Thank you. Second signal, and maybe we can go to someone else in the room. This is a new model called open hiring. And so The Body Shop has actually implemented this, where someone comes in and they ask 3 yes or no questions. And if the answer to those 3 questions is yes, then they're hired immediately on the spot. There's no reference checks, there's no resumes, there's no, hour-long interview. It's just you come in, you say, I'm interested in a job. They ask you 3 yes or no questions. If you answer yes to all 3, they offer you a job. Who would like to react to this signal? What kind of a change are we seeing here? Does anyone hire an employee with three questions, or what's the normal process for hiring for you?
Do we know what kind of questions are those?
So the three questions are, can you lift more than 10 pounds? Can you stand on your feet for at least 3 hours at a time? And can you start working immediately? Those are the 3 questions. There's no background check, there's no drug testing, there's no reference checks, none of that.
Maybe just a guess, somebody with creativity, someone who, think they can do the impossible. I know.
So when we're looking at the future of work and the future of hiring, right? I mean, we've seen the gig economy explode in recent years, right? I mean, this is the gig economy personified. This is the gig economy on steroids, right? I mean, you don't need to be an employee of a company for years and years and years. And this kind of a model, you get up and you go to the nearest place that has a help wanted sign and you immediately start working, right? So this has an ability to change the dynamic of work and relationships. And for many companies, for many employers, that's a scary thought. That's a scary thought to think that you don't know if you're going to have a permanent workforce the next day, right? You don't know who you're going to be hiring the next day. But for employees, it's a sense of freedom. It's a sense of, listen, if I don't like this job, I don't have to worry about going through a long, lengthy process. I can just leave. I can leave my company and go find somewhere else, answer 3 questions, and immediately start working, right? So this is really a combination of the gig economy that we've seen and the changing nature of work. There are other examples that we can get to, but I hope this gives you a sense of the kind of signals of change that we look for, the kinds of questions that we ask. But really for us, there are a lot of groups out there that talk about the future, and they're all focused on the big trends. They're all focused on what is the big trends, the big forces, what are the things that we know for sure. And that's great. That's wonderful to think about. But the key difference that strategic foresight is all about is unlocking and looking for those innovations that kind of make you pause, they make you think, and they really ask yourself, if you took this seriously, because the whole world doesn't take these seriously yet. They don't take these small local innovations seriously yet because they haven't scaled. But if the world took them seriously, what would the world start to look like? And I can tell you from the Institute's experience, 50 plus years, 80% of our forecasted futures happening, being able to go out and look for that evidence and ask those important questions is how you avoid getting disrupted, is how you avoid, or is how you better prepare yourself for the inevitable disruptions of the future. So with that, I'm at the end of my presentation here. I'd love to answer your questions, get your reactions, or just hear any comments from you all.
Yeah, interesting on the weak signal, and in the corporate they are concerned, the trend, big trend, but when we pick up, small signal, maybe we have 100 or more. How can we gather those big signal into the big you know,
Yeah.
issue, or what would be the application from the forecast, and
Yeah,
how we could convince, or how can we could use the information for
absolutely.
strategic planning. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's a great question. So the great thing about signals is that signals have the potential to turn into trends. It's just going to take time. It's going to take time. So what you're doing is you're figuring out what are those trends early before they become trends. Because once they become a trend, everyone is talking about them, right? Once it becomes a trend, everyone is thinking about and creating strategies for the trend. But looking for signals is about looking for trends before they become trends. Now, all of the signals aren't going to become trends, right? What is really interesting is that most signals tend to fail, but they tend to fail in a very interesting way. But it is a precursor to understanding where the future is headed. And so what we do is we track signals, and we encourage people in our network to track signals. And it may be that when you start looking into an area, you only see 1 or 2 signals in a space. And then over a year, over 2 years, you start to see the same signal, but it's happening 20 different places. And so what that tells you is that the marketplace is starting to mature. Your industry is starting to get ready to transform that signal into a trend. And therefore, if you don't have a plan to address that, you're really behind the curve, and you really got to step it up and get in front of it. Very important question. The other thing that I will say, back to, earlier in the presentation, I talked about challenging consensus forecasts, challenging official futures, making sure that we're not biased by precision metrics. Signals of change help us do that, right? Signals of change help us go out and say, listen, everyone thinks cryptocurrency is headed in this direction, but here's this one signal that challenges that. And what if I just thought about, let's take this and grow it, right? Let's think about what would happen. And that prepares you for whatever possible disruption may come in the future. So that's a great question. Wonderful question. Thank you for that. What other questions do you have?
Me.
If not, I have more signals of change to share.
Please, please.
Great. So we saw this one, but let's think about these headphones, where we're starting to see more and more of these, but this translation on the fly, these, language barrier is becoming less of an issue, because you now have headphones that'll hear a foreign language and translate it into your native tongue within seconds. Would anyone just like to think about, what does this mean for the future? What's the implication here for the future? One of the fun things to do is to mix and match signals. So let's take, for example, this 3 questions, right? Getting hired in 3 questions. And this language barrier one, these headphones that translate. What's to stop me in a future where this is the new reality? What's the future to stop me from getting on a flight, showing up in Thailand, popping these headphones in, going to a store, answering 3 yes or no questions, and immediately start working in Thailand, right? The way that we think about work and transition and what is possible completely starts to get disrupted. It's completely a new way of thinking about work, right? Right now, everyone's talking about remote work and, oh, everyone's working from home and we don't need offices. But these signals are signaling that even if we do return to offices, even if we do return to being in person for work, even if it's not remote, there are other possibilities. But because everyone is so concerned with COVID and offices and working from home, no one's paying attention to these signals. And so what we want to do is we want to go out, we want to find these interesting signals and just ask, what if the future were to be impacted by this future? So here's another one, and this one's fairly recent. The Marriott Hotel in Prague refused to host a conference that was happening, citing political neutrality. So we're seeing now a private company reaching out to a conference and saying, listen, we can't host you because we're scared of the potential backlash we could face, our business could face in a country like China. So we're starting to see some really interesting signals of cross-border, political, influence, political neutrality, these other things that are happening around the globe. And then, of course, you always get these really provocative ones. Researchers are now saying, listen, plastic is already in our food. What if we just ate plastic on purpose, right? There's so much plastic pollution in our seas and in our oceans and in our ecosystem, it ends up in our food anyways. So these researchers are using a bacteria that transforms plastic into an edible protein. So the bacteria breaks down the plastic, turns it into a protein that then you can consume and get nutrients off of. So, everyone's been talking about alternative meats and vegan cheeses and the Impossible Burger, right? But as the trend that we're seeing here is climate change. We need to do something about climate change, and we need to adopt regenerative practices. But this is one that not a lot of people are saying to, and it's saying, yes, climate change is a thing, and we do need to adopt regenerative practices. Why not do it by ingesting plastic on purpose, by turning plastic into an edible protein and trying to solve not only hunger, but the climate issue as well? And then my final signal for you tonight is a new study that finds that children born in 2020 are 2 to 7 times more likely to experience extreme weather events than their grandparents. So whether it's droughts, whether it's flooding, whether it's fires, these natural disasters, this new generation that is coming into this world is 2 to 7 times more likely to experience extreme weather. So think about kids going to school. Think about kids maturing and trying to get jobs, right? This notion of stability, and you grow up in an area and that's your home, that's your hometown for years and years and years to come, is actually being questioned. It's actually up for change based on all the disruptions, the extreme weather events that these kids are going to face. So it makes us think about the future. It makes us think about, how are there notions that we take for granted? How are there notions that we accept as are always going to continue on, but could actually change in the future? And are we ready for that future? Wanwira, Anya, I know you guys took this course with the Institute for the Future. I'm just curious if you've seen any interesting signals since you took the course.
I pick up actually it's your signal that baby born in Japan or China, right, during COVID time. I like it. I like that one very much. And it's the example of very simple thing, can be a very interesting signal. And actually, after that, we try to find the signal that related to our work at TMA too. We're still looking at them from your library. And a question that I would also like to ask is that how do we turn signal into a strategy?
Yeah.
Can you further explain that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what we want to do, I would say, is look to signals to see what is your strategy missing, right? Because everyone has strategies that they focus on presently. But if you can look to a signal or a collection of signals and say, listen, our HR strategy doesn't take into account mobile apps that can offer you jobs, or our current hiring strategy doesn't take into account our competitors hiring people with just 3 questions, that's when you go back and you reevaluate your strategy. So I think oftentimes it's less about what are signals going to, how are we going to create strategies from our signals, but more, how are we going to adapt our strategy? Excuse me. How are we going to adapt our current strategy to address these signals that we're starting to see more and more of? That's most common how it works and how it happens with a lot of our partners.
Okay.
I think continue คุณวันเวลา question when we came out, as you mentioned, adapting the strategy, right? Can you share your experience with partner? How do the partner prepare for the adapting strategy? Because we have the core strategy and we have the weak signal and adaptation plan for the new strategy or whatever. Allocation of people working on the the change in the new trend from the small signal. How do they manage it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let me give you a real example. And this is an example that didn't happen at the Institute, but we were told about it with one of our partners. And this is actually McDonald's, the McDonald's Corporation. Many years ago, McDonald's was not happy with the sale of its milkshakes. They were saying, listen, people aren't buying our milkshakes. And so they tried these marketing campaigns. They tried these advertising campaigns. They tried these promotional things to get people to buy more McDonald's milkshakes. And it wasn't working. And so they said, listen, we need to figure out why aren't people buying McDonald's milkshakes. And so they went and they did a study. And it turned out that the only time people were buying McDonald's milkshakes was in the early morning and in the afternoon. And people were buying McDonald's milkshakes on their way to work or on their way from work. And what they realized is that people didn't necessarily want a milkshake at that time of the day. They just wanted something to do while they were sitting alone in their cars, stuck in traffic. Right? People wanted something to do, something to sip on, something to keep their mind distracted while they're sitting in a traffic jam. And it turned out to be that a McDonald's milkshake was the answer to that. So McDonald's went back and said, listen, our current strategy of trying these promotional things, trying these advertising campaigns isn't going to work. We need to pivot and start targeting. And so they started this like McDonald's happy hour where you could show up between the hours of like 7 and 9 a.m. when people are commuting, or 3 and 6 p.m. and get, a small milkshake for $1 or whatever it was. And it turned out that their sales, the volume of sales for the McDonald's milkshakes went through the roof after they did that. And so ultimately what you want to do with Foresight, and that's a perfect example of Foresight. It's not necessarily 10 years out, but it is thinking about, kind of future sales. What you want to do is get to that core insight. In this case, the core insight was people buy milkshakes not because of the taste, but because they need an activity to do, right? And so based off of that insight, the company said, we need to pivot our strategy to adapt to the insight. So I think oftentimes what we find with our partners, what we find with people in business is that, their strategy to try and address a business challenge, if you don't have the right insight, you're really just shooting out in the dark. You're really just kind of betting on something that's based on trends or information that may not be accurate. So getting to that core insight is super, super important. Now, the way you get to an insight about the future, you have to do the foresight. You have to create a forecast. You have to say, what does the future world look like? One of our clients, one of our former clients was Disney, the Disneyland Parks and Resorts. And here in the United States, after September 11th, 2001, when the Twin Towers were attacked by terrorists, Disney was very worried about, are people going to gather in large crowds if there are terrorist threats running around? And so we worked with them and we figured out the core insight was that the parents wanted safety. The parents, when they showed up to the park, they cared about nothing else but safety. The kids, when the kids showed up, they wanted fun. And so the insight that Disney derived from that research, from that forecast, was the future of fun was, how do you safely scare kids? The future of the Disney park after 9/11 was, how do you safely scare kids? And to this day, that's the model that they operate from. I mean, you can look at the recent Disneyland and Disney World Resort advertisements, and it's literally kids talking to their parents and saying, hey, mom and dad, I know you like to baby me, but I'm here to have fun. So you go relax, go your own way. Let me have my adventure. Let me have my fun because I'm safe here on Disney. So, I think the answer to your question is, in order to adapt your strategy, in order to reevaluate and rethink how you're going to go about your strategy, you have to get to that core insight first. The core insight is fundamental. And I want to be clear here that an insight is not an idea, right? New ideas are plenty. New ideas come every 5 minutes. New ideas just come off of a brainstorming session. An insight is different than an idea. An insight is really hard to come across. And the great thing about an insight is that your understanding of the world, your perception of your future has to fundamentally change when you reach an insight. So oftentimes when we work with a client, it's really rare that a client will get to more than 2 insights. If you get 1 or 2 core insights, you've done your job. You've done your work, and that alone is enough to help you reevaluate your strategy or start to pivot your future strategy.